He knew something about planes, and he had the capacity to do something.
In fact, Prodromo had his commercial pilot's license. It was the first step towards his goal of becoming a captain for Helios.
Today I'd like to be on flight.
Oh, you will, Andreas.
But all of his training wouldn't have helped save the jet. When he was seen at the controls, Flight 522 had been in the air for almost 3 hours. And the reason the Helios plane seemed to veer away from the F-16s following it was because its left engine was out of fuel. No matter what caused the alarms to sound, the ultimate reason for the crash was simple.
The DFDR and the CVR gave us absolute proof that the plane ran out of fuel. And this was the cause of the crash.
Scheduled as a 90-minute flight, the plane didn't have enough fuel to stay in the air for over 3 hours. But why had the plane flown so much longer than it was supposed to? Soulakis now knows who was in the cockpit of the plane and why it crashed. But to fully understand the mystery, he needs more information.
Mayday.
His investigators uncover a suspicious history of maintenance issues with the Helios jet. Issues that could help explain what happened on Flight 522.
Mayday.
A Helios ground engineer tells Soulakis that on the very day of Flight 522, the 737 had a problem with its back door.
When we checked the flight log for the trip, we saw that we'd have to do some unscheduled maintenance.
The plane had arrived in Cyprus just after midnight on August 14th. The cabin crew had heard loud banging noises and saw ice on the rear service door during the flight. It was scheduled to take off again just hours later. Soon after it landed, engineers began checking the problem. To make sure there's nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineers run a pressurization test. During normal flight, a plane's engines force air into the cabin. To ensure oxygen circulates during the trip, small valves in the rear allow some of it to leak out.
A pressurized airplane essentially is sort of like a pressurized can. Well, we pressurize the airplane so that the people inside can survive the environment that the airplane likes to operate in.
Switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
Without the jet's engines running, the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the aircraft. And the cabin is pressurized for several minutes.
It's like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside, and look for leaks that way.
But there's no indication any air is escaping through the back door.
In this case, they felt that it was all right and they completed the test.
The entire jet seems to be in good working order. After performing a series of additional routine maintenance procedures, the engineers signed off on their technical log. Investigators are faced with a dead end. An explosive decompression could have explained the tragic events of Flight 522. If the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the jet, everyone on board could have been overcome. But not only did the engineers check the problem, when the F-16s approached the plane near Athens, no damage was seen. There was no indication that the fuselage was punctured. Investigators are still struggling to solve the mystery. What had overcome the passengers and crew of Helios Flight 522? And why was one flight attendant apparently unaffected? The discovery of one small switch holds the key to the entire crash. The crash of Helios Flight 522 is one of the most mysterious air disasters ever.
Helios 522.
All investigators know for sure is that shortly after takeoff, the crew stopped communicating with air traffic controllers.
Helios 522, over.
Mayday.
Then, after almost 3 hours in the air, one of the plane's flight attendants was seen at the controls. Eventually, the plane ran out of fuel and crashed, killing 121 people. But investigators are stumped. They still don't know what had happened to the plane's captain or the rest of the crew.
Tell me about what happened the day of the flight.
They concentrate on the conversation between the pilot and the Helios engineer shortly after takeoff. As the plane passed through 3,700 meters, an alarm sounded in the cockpit.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our takeoff config warning is on.
Usually, the takeoff config warning is only triggered on the runway, but wreckage recovered at the crash site reveals no problems with the plane's flaps, landing gear, or anything else that could trigger the alarm. So why had it sounded? Chief Investigator Akrivos Solakis focuses on a small control panel found in the wreckage of the ravaged jet.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
We were lucky. Finding this panel, which had the switch on the manual position, was a major one.
Helios 522.
The P5 pressurization panel ensures that passengers have enough air to breathe, even at high altitudes. Normally, pressurization takes place automatically. As the jet climbs, its engines force air into the plane as they power it through the sky. But when the pressurization switch is set to manual, both the captain and co-pilot are responsible for maintaining the cabin atmosphere using a controller.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
I went into the cockpit and turned the pressurization switch to manual.
Solakis learns that during the early morning maintenance check on Helios 522, ground engineers had turned the P5 switch to manual. That allowed them to use the onboard generators to test the pressure seals on the plane's rear door without starting the engines. When the test was over, they didn't turn the switch back to automatic.
The procedure of pressurizing the aircraft has to do with setting the pressurization system from auto to manual. They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
Are eliminated.
Several hours later, when the flight crew entered the cockpit, the pressurization switch was still set to manual.
Right today. Are you almost through?
But neither the pilot nor co-pilot saw it. As a result, after takeoff, the cabin would not pressurize automatically. And the higher Flight 522 climbed, the thinner the atmosphere became. Not turning the switch back to automatic was a deadly, hidden danger.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
Solakis believes this panel could be the key to the disaster. Leaving one switch on manual could have led to all the other problems the plane faced. To prove he's right, he takes an unusual, potentially dangerous step. Four months after the crash of Helios Flight 522, the search for answers into the disaster takes a highly unorthodox turn. Chief Investigator Akrivos Solakis takes an Olympic Airlines 737 on the same route flown by the Helios jet. If he's right about what caused the crash, this plane should react exactly like the doomed airliner did.
Are we ready to go?
When there is a complicated accident like this, I think a reenactment should be performed. Of course, it's expensive to have a jetliner flying for 3 or 4 hours.
Make sure the P5 is set to manual. It's hard. back to sea.